Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul from the Sirius report, and this is another Ukraine briefing. Now, clearly, we're going to discuss the Ukrainian ATACMS missile strikes on Russian territory. Now, there were claims yesterday that Biden had authorized the use of ATACMS to strike long-range targets inside Russia. So, what's the reality of this? Well, firstly, I suspect it wasn't Biden. I suspect someone else in the administration was responsible. Now, interestingly, the White House didn't comment on this statement, neither did the State Department. Anyway, at this point in time, it's not clear who's responsible, but the idea it was Biden seems extremely unlikely. Now, clearly there were statements that came out before there was any statement issued by the Russians themselves, where the Ukrainian military said it carried out its first strike on Russian territory using, obviously, these ATACMS missiles. According to Ukrainian sources, they targeted a military facility near the town of Karashev, which is in Russia's Bryansk region, saying they had successfully hit this facility. Now, Karashev is located about 80 miles, 130 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. So the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces said there was this attack on this weapons depot at this location. Didn't make any specification about the type of weapon used. Now, subsequently, the Russians came out and confirmed that the Ukrainians did launch 6 ATACMS missiles at this facility, or presumably at this facility. 5 were shot down, another one was damaged, but debris of the one that wasn't shot down struck the facility in Bryansk, caused a small fire. There was no casualties, and they certainly didn't blow up the facility in the process. Now, I want to put some context in this because, of course, the immediate response to this is, oh, this is going to be World War III. And I'll explain why it's not going to be World War III. Because firstly, if you go back to June of this year, the Ukrainians used ATACMS equipped with cluster munitions against Sevastopol in Crimea. It was obviously, they killed civilians. There were also claims at the time when the ATACMS was launched at Sevastopol, a US Global Hawk long-range surveillance drone was detected over the Black Sea. At the time, the Russian Ministry of Defense stated that it held Washington and Ukraine responsible for the deliberate missile strike on Sevastopol civilians, and therefore responsibility for this deliberate missile strike against this civilian population lay primarily, they said, with Washington, who supplied the weapon to Ukraine, as well as with Ukraine itself, from whose territory, of course, the strike was launched. They said such actions will not go unanswered, but it didn't result in World War III. Now, of course, there are people who are trying to explain this away by going, well, Crimea wasn't part of Russia pre-2014. That's irrelevant. As far as Russia's concerned, it's Russian territory. And in that sense, Russia is not going to respond by instigating World War III because such actions would be disproportionate to the attack on Sevastopol itself. Now, if we go back historically, there was a huge reluctance in the Biden administration to give authorization to use these weapons. That was primarily due to the Pentagon and intelligence agencies advising against it because of what the Russian response might be. Now, it's quite interesting that on the basis of this claim of Biden authorizing these strikes with these long-range missiles from Ukrainian territory, again, as these claims, it's deep inside Russia. No, it's not, because it has a maximum range of about 190 miles, the ATACMS, and typically 175 is about the limit. Interestingly, thus far, there was claims and reports suggesting that no one else was particularly keen on this idea. The German leadership basically came out and said, we're not going to authorize Taurus missiles. That's what Scholz said. It's interesting, French and UK delegations at the G20 in Rio de Janeiro were very hesitant to comment on this in any way, shape or form. There was a statement in the French media suggesting that France and the UK was going to join the US and allow Ukraine to use their Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles. However, the media then retracted this statement without providing any explanation. And it's interesting, the French Foreign Ministry came out and said, look, we've not modified our stance on strikes inside Russia itself. Now, the European Union itself came out and stated that the US had lifted restrictions on ATACMS, and there was claims this had been discussed at an EU foreign ministers meeting, but there was no agreement on the way forward, and that each member state would make their own decision as to whether they wanted their missiles to be used or not. Again, it's worth repeating the fact that the White House had not confirmed that permission was given, nor the State Department. Doesn't say someone in the administration somewhere gave authorization, but potentially it certainly wasn't any of the obvious people such as Biden in the process. Now, let's talk a little bit about ATACMS itself. As I say, they have a maximum range of about 190 miles. So the Americans' philosophy has always been, it doesn't matter what they actually strike, it's pretty pointless giving Ukraine the ability to do so because they're not going to change or affect the war in any way, shape or form. And frankly, we might believe we know what Russia's response might be, but we're not going to take the risk. I mean, the other thing is they have an accuracy of around 10 meters, so they can't be used for precision strikes. They're a bit of a blunt instrument. And then the argument is with ATACMS, how is the Ukraine going to destroy Russian air bases? They're outside the range of ATACMS missiles. I mean, the argument is, well, okay, they obviously tried to strike this military facility 80 miles in, but is the United States prepared to take the risk that Ukraine might use them to strike civilian targets? This all put the West in a very difficult position because then in that situation, they can't claim Russia was responsible. And therefore, it could create an escalation. It was something the West just didn't want to entertain. It's also worth noting the following. We shouldn't forget that the US allowed HIMARS to be used within Russian borders. That was after Russia's incursion into the Kharkov region. At the time, there was all this widespread hysteria. Oh, it's going to cause World War III. Again, it never transpired. And let's be really clear about one thing. HIMARS range is the same as ATACMS. So potentially the argument is exactly the same. And again, Russia's response was not, we're going to have World War III. The other thing is Russia's capability to shoot these missiles down. We've seen in this example where Russia claimed they shot 5 out of 6 and damaged another one. So effectively, they partially shot that one down as well. But Russia has the most modern electronic warfare systems in the world, with the longest range and also the most powerful GPS and radio frequency jammers of any country in the world. And Russia's EW systems have been very effective, at basically preventing 90% thus far of guided missiles and drone systems used by or supplied by the United States to Ukraine basically miss their target. And of course, these Russian GPS jammers will prove and have proved to be very effective against missiles, including, of course, the ATACMS. The other thing is Russian jamming systems are also very effective against US-supplied Ukrainian air defense systems, including the Patriot missile system and Hawk missiles as well. And really the argument is Russia's more than capable of handling this ATACMS problem, and certainly it doesn't fall into the category of an escalation that warrants then going on a World War III footing. The other thing that's worth recalling, and this has been the statement from the Pentagon and US intelligence agencies, they've said, look, we caution against the use of long-range weapons because the they basically assessed that 90% of Russian aircraft have been relocated to airfields in excess of 300 kilometers away from Ukrainian-controlled territory, which is outside the range of ATACMS. Russians have also moved their aircraft that are using glide bombers that are beyond the range of ATACMS. So basically the argument again is they're ineffective. They're not really going to achieve any objectives. Ukraine could obviously strike strategic targets inside Russia using drones or other domestically produced weapons. So why give them the authorization to do so? Now, we're not saying someone hasn't done that. It's quite likely the authorization is being given to throw a massive spanner in the Trump administration's works and try to say, well, we'll put him in a position where he can't decide to implement his philosophy of walking away from the war and trying to end it. Okay, whether his plan's successful or not, or his plan has any real validity, is not the point. The other thing I want to make is these Storm Shadow missiles that everyone talks about only have a range of about 155 miles. None of these weapons are long-range weapons. This statement about striking deep inside Russia is a complete misnomer. It has no basis in reality. And overall, when you look at this assessment, there is absolutely no reason whatsoever for Russia to respond by trying to engage with NATO and risk starting World War III. There is no doubt there will be a Russian response. We know that. To what extent that Russian response is remains to be seen. Previously, when arguably similar attacks have been made, Russia's then conducted nationwide bombing, including targeting energy infrastructure, and they're likely to do that again. And another point worth making is, obviously, Putin signed the decree which ratifies their updated nuclear doctrine, and there's people claiming, well, this is evident that Russia's going to go to a nuclear footing and start World War III. Well, let's assess what was actually stated, because this is regarding the basic principles of state policy of Russia on nuclear deterrence. And basically the essence of the document is that nuclear weapons, note, are the last resort to safeguard the country's sovereignty. And the document broadens the scope of countries and alliances subject to nuclear deterrence. The list of military threats against which nuclear deterrence can be employed have also been revised, for sure. And it does state, yes, aggression from any non-nuclear state with the involvement or support of a nuclear state will be treated as a joint attack on Russia. So people have come to the conclusion going, well, Ukraine's the non-nuclear state. The support of a nuclear state is because the United States provides the ATACMS and GPS coordinates or satellite positioning, because GPS doesn't work over Ukraine and Russia. And we'll come on to why that's not applicable in this case, because it also makes the proviso that these attacks have to be of a critical nature. Now, with all due respect, an ATACMS strike on a facility that was prevented is not in the category of critical. Yes, of course, the Russians will respond, but they're not going to respond on the basis of this revised nuclear doctrine. Just another small point is worth making, that also an attack on Belarus, given its union state status with Russia, would also invoke a nuclear doctrine, potentially. So, as ever, it's really important to emphasize the difference between what this applies to and why it isn't a blanket statement that if the United States is either implicitly or explicitly involved in assisting Ukraine with the launch of missiles, that therefore constitutes the basically triggering their nuclear doctrine. It absolutely doesn't. And now I want to be absolutely clear about something, because this is extremely important. With regards to the issue of the ATACMS missiles, yes, the United States has provided them. Yes, arguably the United States could be the ones pressing the button and firing the missiles. Yes, the United States could be providing via satellite technology the coordinates for Ukraine to strike targets. No one's disputing that. Absolutely not. However, I would say there is the potential for this to be the case. Yes, the United States still provides the ATACMS. It is perfectly feasible for the Ukrainians to be able to launch the missiles themselves. They have the capability to do that. So then the last point is, well, what about targeting? What about providing satellite technology? Now, we can say without fear of contradiction that the Ukrainians have launched attacks in the Bryansk region previously. They have certainly had drones flying over that territory previously. It is possible, and I stress possible, that the Ukrainians could get very crude coordinates from one of their own drones to target a facility, such as this military facility in Bryansk region. Now, it doesn't mean they did, but it's a possibility, and therefore you cannot totally dismiss the possibility that Ukraine fired the missiles themselves and used very crude coordinates they obtained themselves because of flying drones which have been all over Russia, and we know this to be the case because remember, a drone was shot down over the Kremlin. I mean, as one very clear example of how far these Ukrainian drones have flown into Russian territory previously. Remains to be seen, of course, what the Russian response is, and we'll comment on that accordingly. But I think this assesses what the situation currently is. We're being objective and concise as ever as to what we're discussing. There is no place for endless waffle and debate. These are facts. The last bit we said about Ukraine is an opinion, but I think it's an opinion that has some validity, and it certainly shouldn't be something that's outright dismissed as being impossible. And therefore, on that basis, we'll end this podcast today. And with that, I'll say goodbye.